Like most people, I turned on Alice in Borderland randomly and ended up binging the entire show in one day. The concept is fascinating. The way things unfold make it sort of addicting. It's not something we get in a lot of live action shows, not even in Asian media. So after I got through all 8 episodes, something about it just kept bothering me, and I thought I would take this opportunity to break down exactly what male gaze is in modern media. I know, it's based on a manga that began in like 2010, and fortunately a lot of things did not make it into the show from the manga. I know I read like the first 30 in like a day. The creators of this live action did take a lot of liberty in adapting this for a Netflix audience, and I thank them for that. But there are still a lot of things that they intentionally left out or intentionally put in that are just hard for me to look past. If you haven't yet seen my video on the feminine gaze, I highly recommend that before or after you finish this video. But as a refresher, the term male gaze comes from an essay by Laura Mulvey, who is studying film from a psychoanalysis perspective. She proposes in her work that the pleasures of cinema are dominated by the male gaze, and when she realized this, she could no longer enjoy some of the films that she used to love, because she had suddenly become this third party to this voyeuristic experience. Now, when I started to delve into feminine media and feminine fandom, this happened to me too. I started to realize that men had an aversion to women's media, but there was plenty of men's media that I thoroughly enjoyed. And along that thread of thought, I suddenly realized that men's media was the standard, and women's media typically hides in the realm of the guilty pleasure, or it's just shared between women. And when you do realize this, you start to see certain parts of the male gaze as concerning or even offensive. So as a sort of weird psychoanalytical exercise, I'm going to show you exactly what is male gazy about this show. From here on out, this review will be spoiler heavy, so you have been warned. This is like the horror trope where the girl who is perceived as a slut is killed very quickly, but the girl who is obviously a virgin lives. This is actually presented in this show as a binary of sorts, meaning you have two opposites playing off of each other and they're kind of like the only options available. This is mainly in episode 2 where the girl who slept with her boss to get a promotion decides to have sex with Chota because I guess they're both Christians? I do appreciate the art of it and what they were trying to do with the scenes here, but it does further magnify the issues with the female characters. In the manga, Sori Shibuki, I'm gonna butcher these names, is not as manipulative as she is in the show. She isn't shown as someone who would sleep with her boss to get a promotion. She actually sleeps with Chota after saying that they were the same because they both didn't have the will to live. It's not manipulative, it's just pure wish fulfillment. Let's have some fun before we inevitably die. And she's almost protective of him, almost like she's his mother, which is pretty much the theme that they were latching on to in the show by adding in all the stuff about Chota's mom. She also makes the decision on her own not to go after Arasu during the wolf game. Chota does not have to hold her down. I say all this because these were deliberate changes made to her character to make her more manipulative, basically a femme fatale who threatens the boys' friendships rather than a complex character with needs and desires of her own. And whereas Shibuki is presented as a femme fatale, Yusugi is presented as pure and good. She never had to choose someone else's life over hers, and as far as we know, she hasn't been loyal to any sort of team, so she's unsoiled by this world. I know that what they're trying to show here is that whoever you were in the real world will catch up to you eventually in this one. It will be your darkness, your downfall, your main obstacle. But Yusugi doesn't deal with any of those things that happened before. She's a strong, capable, pretty girl that just happens to have bad stuff happen to her. We do see this a lot in Japanese media. The main female character has bad stuff happen to her, but she's not responsible for any bad things happening, whereas the main guy absolutely is, and he often has to atone for those sins by proving that he's learned better and has grown up. Another binary is here where we have our main female character wearing modest gym wear to the pool, juxtaposed with all the girls wearing tiny bikinis. My one fear for the second season is that they're going to force Yusugi into a more revealing outfit in order to show the audience how much she's maturing into a young woman, but without actually giving any story or context from her point of view to see that growth. We have seen it plenty of times before in this kind of media.
Looks like she's a little older than you thought.
I really won't be surprised if that occurs. You can see how low my bar is for these types of shows. But this whole thing doesn't actually bother me as much as the other stuff I'm gonna get into, because honestly it is based off of shonen manga. It was made for horny 17-year-olds. But I do wish here the showrunners took a little more liberty in teasing out a journey for Yusugi in the first season, because honestly there's just a ton of potential there. So there's a content warning for suicide that shows up in the corner of every single episode of this season. Like most things in the show, this is presented as a binary of sorts. Either you have the will to live or you are weak. Forget about mental illness, because that doesn't play a factor in this world. So the only way out of this cycle of pain and torment is suicide for a greater cause, otherwise known as sacrifice. You can have the will for others to live, and apparently that is enough. I get that these are heroic themes in both Eastern and Western storytelling, but it does seem a little heavy-handed at times, especially when the mental health aspect is shown, but not really dealt with. So let's talk about the absolute worst things in the show. I think this was the moment at which I knew I needed to talk about this show at great length. I get that it's fan service, but usually fan service is done in the realm of the animated, where the boobs aren't real, gravity is a pesky rule, and morality is an afterthought getting in the way of escapism. These aren't real bodies, but these are. Now I'm all for sex and sexuality being depicted in live action, but again, these shots are made for the male gaze. Not for me. It developed from a boyhood fantasy, easily digestible by adult men because it is that boyhood fantasy in the flesh. Paired with violence against women, it's now a fantasy of controlling and exploiting women. Making a few tweaks here and there to the show makes a huge difference. This shot here took me out of the scene completely, reminding me that I am a woman watching this through this male gaze. Woman in a red bikini at the center of the frame, everyone around her is unfocused, and this view is used twice as a crowd reaction shot. A more compelling shot would have been the full crowd, potentially a focus on some background characters that have obvious personalities just from the way they stand or from the way they react. So let's talk about the way that this happens. This is the way it's portrayed in the manga, which is something I was really, really interested to find out, but I still despise it. It's really just a surrealist choice made to titillate the male viewer. This shot occurs not long after it, and it just further makes my point. I shouldn't even have to comment on this. The scene with Hikari fighting the sword guy is absolute excellence. But I'm actually scared the reason it's so good is because, now, hear me out, because the gaze on this character is somewhat transphobic. In this moment, we discover that Hikari is transgender, and it's done really freaking well. But I realized during the fight, there's no shot focusing on her breasts or her butt. There's no lighting choices that make her cleavage stand out or make her butt look fuller. Her frame is actually kind of boyish. But newsflash, the actress that plays her is not transgender. And it's like, did they really treat her body as a guy's because they know that the male gaze cannot desire a transgender woman? And yes, that's exactly what it is. I answered my own questions by going on the subreddit. And no, I'm not saying she should have been viewed that way because she's a woman. I'm saying that the focus of the gaze tells us a lot. The point of discussing these differences between masculine gaze stories and feminine gaze stories is for both men and women to move freely between the positions of being a sexual subject and a sexual object. We're complex beings that want to desire and want to be desired. Just one or the other is simply not telling the full story. This scene where they tie up Usagi on the bed is so unnecessarily long, and the licking is ridiculous. They added this sound effect because I guess it wasn't gross enough already? Again, the shots are exploitive. The reason it's so long is because it's just giving male viewers time to take her in while she's vulnerable, something that doesn't happen often. There are a few other examples I could use, but it's kind of too explicit for my channel. But understand that there are ways to portray sex and sexuality that are pleasing to both men and women, but the show consistently chooses to do what is most pleasing to men. There's this assumption in mainstream media that women don't like or don't watch science fiction, gory fantasy, or horror, but we do, and some women have internalized the male gaze in a way that they can watch and enjoy it, even when it fails to represent them, even when it's incredibly offensive. And while we do enjoy it, it doesn't mean that we can't also critique it and criticize it and demand it for it to be better. I truly love Joey Soloway's 3 points made in their 2016 masterclass on the female gaze. These points are what Joey sees as the female gaze, and they're closest that I have been able to get to as a sort of definition of demand. 1, the feeling camera, which prioritizes emotion over action. 2, the gazed gaze, which shows the audience how it feels to be the object of the gaze. And 3, returning the gaze, where the object tells the audience how they feel about being seen. All of these points rely on one very important thing: self-awareness and self-exploration of one's own gaze. If the filmmakers aren't self-aware, if they thought this was artistic or purposeful, or had some deeper meaning, then what does that say about them? And if the filmmakers are aware of it, and yet they're still choosing to use shots like this, then what does that say about our willingness to continue to accept that? Don't forget to like and subscribe and sign up for notifications, and thank you so much for watching!